Talking about public service publishers, how are these conceived in your mind, and how will they operate?
Well, around about 5 years ago, when Ofcom, I think it's about that, when Ofcom last looked at the public service broadcasting system, we were at pains to think about how the system might develop over time, and to make it clear that we didn't believe, well, and certainly I don't believe, that the characteristics that make something a public service activity are defined by it being on television or on radio, that the new platforms at that point, internet, etc., were capable of delivering public value in some shape or form. But we also wanted to make it clear that if you were to think like that, which I do and many people do, you would need to rethink quite a lot of the basic ideas of public service broadcasting and just make sure some of them fitted and some of them didn't fit. You wouldn't just import them wholesale into the new world. So we explored this idea of a public service publisher, which would take some of the same characteristics of the content as being informative or educational, but try and apply that into new interactive media platforms.
In a way, it's trying to make some break between the idea of, in a sense, funding public interest broadcasting or public interest content and not confusing that with the existing organisation.
Yes, definitely that. And two things really. One was to try and help update the way we thought about what our existing organisations were doing. So that, for instance, shortly after that work, Channel 4's remit in this country was extended to include other platforms than television. So that was one idea, that we would think about extending the way we measured the work that existing players did, but also we would think harder, therefore, about how we spend money on media content, money on interactive content. So that took us, into areas looking at money that might have been spent by the Education Department, or money that might be spent by the Arts Council, or other players in the social, cultural space.
And indeed certain kinds of film funding, presumably.
Yes, and science funding actually as well. All sorts of areas where you started to look at how you could achieve public aims, but using the new media, but not just be trapped into the way that it had always been done in broadcasting, which was an interesting and an interesting process. And there are now projects coming to light. For instance, a new project with the Arts Council and the BBC called The Space, where they're going to spend £3 or £4 million experimenting with actually what would something look like.
What PSPs would be.
What a public service publisher might look like.
And in terms of copyright, how would this be handled for the PSPs?
Well, we thought very much that, and I still think that you essentially need to work from first principles. And where public funding is going into content, you need to be very, very careful that sufficient public value comes out of it. And so you could, with some propositions, you could start right at the basis that you do with, for instance, basic scientific research, which is that if you receive a large amount of public funding, then that material should be made widely available, potentially rights-free, or certainly with no commercial rights attached, right through to the more traditional model, where you're operating in more commercial markets. And that debate isn't unique to the concept of public service publishers. That's the debate that the BBC is having about its archive, for instance. Which parts of the archive should be released on DVD or downloads and charged, and which parts might be released under educational licences or something else, because their social value outweighs their commercial value. And so it's quite a common topic to have to consider.
And what funding bodies might get involved with looking at PSPs beyond the ones that we've talked about?
I think the public service publishing approach is something that you can apply wherever public money is being spent on media activity. So, for instance, you could absolutely see scientific funding bodies, large trust funds that fund scientific research, getting involved in this sort of space. You can see our existing cultural institutions themselves and the bodies that fund them getting involved, and educational areas particularly, I think, because we are talking about, at essence, we're talking about rebalancing the commercial to public benefit equation, which, because the economics of broadcasting work in a certain way, though that balance has been set in a certain way. Now, in large parts of cultural and commercial life, the internet is changing those balances, and we haven't really caught up with that in the way I would like us to in public service media. It would be interesting if you were starting again if you were starting now. You were to say we're going to spend a reasonable sum of money, few tens of millions, 100 million or something on this. Would you start trying to replicate a public service entity like the BBC, or would you be trying to work out where the gaps were in the way that the provision on the internet works? There's an idea that's also worth slaying about the fact the internet just provides everything. Because anybody can publish. Because obviously the internet will provide everything, which is a great sort of comforting fallacy of people who frankly haven't thought hard enough about it. It doesn't work like that. If you look at what's happening in journalism, for instance, the internet is not providing new ways of funding long-form investigative journalism that a newspaper would once have done.
Or international news.
And very much not international news, because there's no short-term commercial benefit to doing that. And so you have to ask, are we happy with that notion? We just give up on that? Or is there something that is worth engaging with in interesting new ways?
And on a wider canvas, or perhaps even a more specific industry canvas, how can broadcast producers continue to make a living in an online world where both production budgets and advertising are being squeezed?
I subscribe to one overarching sort of principle on this, and I've been saying it on and off in lectures and articles over the years, that television is becoming more powerful and therefore commercially much higher potential at one extreme. So very large global formats that span platforms very well, are much more lucrative and have a much greater impact than they ever did, and I don't see that changing. Whether that is a massive sports right,
export content,
whether it's global anyway, so Formula One or football or major events like the Oscars, whatever they are, or whether it, as you say, can export either as a format or as a programme. And at the other extreme, the niche is becoming cheaper to make and is becoming easier to commercialise to some degree. The difficulty is in the middle. The majority of content that many television producers have traditionally made has been not watched by very many people, and most of whom didn't really care about it very much. And that is a problem.
Stuff like documentaries.
I'm not sure it's documentary. I think the people who care about documentaries care about them a lot. It's sort of wallpaper television that fills out schedules. I don't know. There's a long-term there's much long-term survival for another set of property shows, another set which are fill out an awful lot of schedules. But documentaries have the same problem as journalism in some ways. How do you pay for the opportunity cost of making it when it may take 20 years to recoup the cost of doing that, or whatever amount of time that's going to be?